A promising young doctor, a sudden death, and a family secret, George Henry Lamson's life took a dark turn that shocked the world. Was it desperation or a deadly plot for inheritance? Find out the chilling truth behind Percy's mysterious death. Early life. George Henry Lamson was born on September 8, 1852, into a family with high expectations. His father, William Lamson, was a respected clergyman in Italy, ministering to an American expatriate community in Florence. His mother, Julia Woodchill, came from a distinguished American lineage. Her father, Robert Schuler, was a well-known figure in New York's finance and railroads, and her grandfather was Philip Jeremiah Schuler, the brother-in-law of Alexander Hamilton, one of America's founding fathers. Growing up in such an esteemed family, George was expected to achieve great things. He was gifted with languages, mastering both French and German with ease. His charm and ability to make friends added to his appeal. His early years were filled with idealism and ambition, and he seemed destined for success. In his youth, George joined the French Ambulance Corps during the Franco-Prussian War, tending to the wounded during the 1871 siege of Paris. His bravery earned him the prestigious Legion of Honor. Later, George worked as a volunteer surgeon in Romania and Serbia, further proving his dedication to helping others. Despite his promising start and the respect he earned on foreign battlefields, George's life would soon take a darker turn. Addiction and debt. After returning to England in 1878, George Henry Lamson seemed ready to lead a stable and respected life. He married Kate John, whose family had once been wealthy but had fallen on hard times. With access to Kate's inheritance, George set out to establish a medical practice in Bournemouth, a thriving seaside town. He rented a grand property and invested in his practice, even before it had any patients. However, despite his qualifications and decorated past, George struggled to build a patient base. The established doctors in the area made it difficult for him to gain clients. Living beyond his means, George sought to project the image of a successful, respectable gentleman doctor. But beneath the surface, his life was falling apart. He had developed an addiction to morphine, a dependency that had started during his time on the battlefield. The drug, which had once numbed the physical and emotional pain of war, was now an essential part of his daily routine. This addiction affected both his finances and his mind. George's debts grew rapidly, and creditors began to close in. His bank accounts were drained, and his wife's inheritance was quickly disappearing. By 1879, he was already in financial trouble. When his brother-in-law, Herbert John, died unexpectedly, George temporarily received a share of his estate, but this relief was short-lived. By 1881, George was again in dire straits, struggling to keep up appearances while facing increasing debt. His addiction, combined with his financial woes, left him teetering on the brink of ruin. Percy's death. By late 1881, George's situation had become even more desperate. He was drowning in debt and had already lost the respect of his medical peers. With his practice in ruins and his personal finances spiraling out of control, George decided to flee to America, hoping for a fresh start. However, his escape was not driven by opportunity. It was to avoid the impending collapse of his financial and personal life. Before leaving, he made one last visit to his wife's brother, Percy Malcolm John, who lived at a school in Wimbledon. Percy was a 19-year-old young man who suffered from paralysis due to a childhood illness, which left him dependent on a wheelchair. Despite his condition, Percy was cheerful, intelligent, and eager to participate in school activities. He was also the last remaining heir to the John family estate, which made him a crucial part of George's financial plans. On December 3, 1881, George visited Percy at the school, bringing with him a cake and a box of capsules. George appeared worn out, his face pale and eyes tired, as he presented the cake to Percy and the headmaster, Mr. Bedbrook. After some conversation, George offered Percy a pill from his black bag, claiming it was a helpful medicine he had brought from America. Percy, trusting his brother-in-law, took the pill. Soon after swallowing the pill, Percy began to feel ill. He complained of heartburn, nausea, and severe pain. Within hours, he collapsed. His condition worsened rapidly, and despite the efforts of the school's matron and a local doctor, Percy's breathing failed, and he died later that evening. The suddenness of Percy's death, just hours after George's visit, raised suspicions. His symptoms were consistent with poisoning, and the authorities were called in to investigate. The tragic and mysterious death of Percy Malcolm John would soon unravel the dark secrets surrounding George Henry Lamson. The trial. News of Percy's sudden and unexplained death spread quickly, drawing public attention and sparking suspicion. Authorities began to piece together the events surrounding the young man's death. The evidence pointed towards poisoning, and suspicion naturally fell on George Henry Lamson, who had been the last person to see Percy alive. The investigation uncovered alarming details about George's financial troubles, his addiction to morphine, and his questionable behavior leading up to Percy's death. George returned to London after hearing about Percy's death in the newspapers. He walked into Scotland Yard and claimed to be distressed by the incident, but his calm demeanor did little to ease the suspicions surrounding him. The police had already started to connect the dots between his actions and Percy's sudden illness. It was revealed that George had purchased a rare and potent poison at Kennington just days before Percy's death. He had been seen buying it at a chemist's shop, where he had requested it be labeled clearly as a poison, a precaution that seemed highly suspicious. During the trial, the prosecution argued that George had poisoned Percy in order to gain access to his inheritance. The defense, however, claimed that George's long-standing addiction to morphine and his mental health struggles, possibly compounded by a family history of mental illness, had clouded his judgment. Despite the defense's appeal for clemency on the grounds of insanity, the evidence was overwhelming. Witnesses testified to George's worsening financial situation and his growing desperation. Toxicologists explained how the poison had acted on Percy's body, and others recounted how George had been seen acting strangely in the days leading up to the death. The jury deliberated and found George Henry Lamson guilty of murder. The verdict was met with shock, but it seemed the dark secrets of his troubled life had finally caught up with him. Execution. After being found guilty of murdering Percy Malcolm John, George Henry Lamson's fate seemed sealed. The judge sentenced him to death by hanging, a punishment that stunned the public. The case had captivated the nation, with newspapers reporting every development. The tragic death of a young man, combined with the involvement of a well-spoken doctor with international connections, made this a case that would be remembered for years to come. In the days following his conviction, George's defense team made a last-ditch effort to save him. Led by his lawyer, Monty Williams, they appealed for clemency on the grounds of George's mental health. They argued that his long-standing morphine addiction, along with a potential hereditary mental illness, had clouded his judgment and led him to commit the crime. The case even attracted the attention of the American president, Chester Arthur, who requested a delay in the execution to allow for further examination of George's family history and possible mental illness. However, despite this rare diplomatic intervention, the British authorities were unconvinced. After reviewing the evidence and the medical documents presented, they found no compelling reason to override the jury's verdict. The Home Office rejected the appeal for clemency, and George's execution was scheduled to go ahead as planned. On the morning of April 28, 1882, George Henry Lamson was executed by hanging at Wandsworth Prison. His death marked the end of a tragic tale, one that had seen a decorated war hero descend into addiction, financial ruin, and ultimately murder. Despite his initial charm and promising future, George's life has spiraled into darkness, culminating in the cold, heart-wrenching end of Percy's life and his own. George's twisted journey ended in a tragic execution, but the story doesn't end here. Stay tuned for our next video. How a simple mistake led to a deadly crime. Don't miss out on another case that will keep you on the edge of your seat.